A while ago, you'll remember that I uploaded a video documenting the history of EnchantedMob, a prominent Minecraft animation studio that's been involved in seemingly an endless slew of controversies over the last couple of years, along with its subsidiary, Examination. That video has now grown to 70,000 views, and I'd like to thank everyone who helped to get to that point, especially Dags, a fellow content creator who made his own videos relating to the subject and gave me a significant algorithm boost. But now, I'm gonna have to follow up on that video because a lot has gone down in the months since. I assure you all, the saga of EnchantedMob is far from over. The day after my original video came out, Mob released their latest project, a horror game called Poppy Playtime. This game would go on to take the algorithm by storm and become a temporary hit, leaving its mark on internet history, though it's uncertain for how long it will last. On the surface, Poppy Playtime seems like little more than a generic horror title, but under the facade is a complex and nuanced controversy, one that I'm going to attempt explaining today. Let me rewind a little and give you all a brief summary of the feud between EnchantedMob and Ekrcoaster. Ekrcoaster is a smaller animator who was inspired to make content by Mob, but quickly fell under the scrutiny of their community. Why? Well, they thought he was ripping them off, which definitely wasn't the case because, well, you're allowed to take inspiration from people you look up to. Ekrcoaster's animations were also harshly criticized, especially by Animation Sins, a CinemaSins-like channel run by Mob. Ekrcoaster ended up in a really bad place mentally and took a long break from YouTube in between 2019 and 2020. But in June of the latter year, he released a document revealing that Zach Belanger himself, the manager of EnchantedMob, had harassed him on multiple occasions through Discord. People were understandably angry at what Zach had done, as well as the additional harassment Ekrcoaster was receiving from the community at large, and there was a huge backlash against Mob and its subsidiaries. However, nothing really came of this situation, and Mob continued to make content as per usual, while Ekrcoaster, now back to YouTube, moved on to a new, more experimental type of content. The situation hadn't been resolved per se, but it had calmed down, and for a while it seemed like it was gonna fizzle out completely. But 4 days after the release of Poppy Playtime, Ekrcoaster posted a thread on Twitter accusing Mob of stealing his ideas for the game. You see, in 2020, a year before Poppy Playtime came out, he even released his own horror game, Venge. In his Twitter thread, he pointed out various similarities between the two games, and was very insistent on the idea that Mob had stolen from him, and was still messing with him like they had before. A lot of people showed support for Ekrcoaster, but there were also some who were critical of his accusations, believing him to be immature and grasping at straws. Initially, I completely stood by his side, as I had already looked into the situation before and I had no reason to stand with Mob. That being said, while I continue not to do so, probably forever at that, I have thought more critically about this situation in the time since. Today, I intend to carry out an objective analysis of the similarities between the two games, and come to my own conclusion free of as much bias as possible. And therein lies the question. Was Ekrcoaster wrong with his accusations, or is Poppy Playtime really stolen like he claims? The short answer is simple. I don't know. As unsatisfying as that may sound, there is nothing conclusive that proves either side of the dispute right, at least for now. The game very well could have been stolen, but that isn't for certain, nor is it guaranteed that it wasn't. We really do have little chance of figuring anything out for sure. That being said, after looking into it, I did come up with a few potential theories that I'll discuss later on. I imagine that if you're this far into the video, you want the long answer, so allow me to oblige. Let's dive into the Poppy Playtime controversy and discuss what we find. Here we have the Twitter thread Ekrcoaster made when he first accused Mob of stealing his ideas. Firstly, he presents the similarities in the concept and premise of the two games, and shows the Steam descriptions to indicate that there was at least some intentional plagiarism in that regard. The concept is not exactly the same, with some key differences. That being said, there are very notable similarities in the way these two descriptions are phrased, such as the emphasis on the companies in both games being massive and influential in their respective industries. That of course is nowhere near a smoking gun, since both of these games are undoubtedly inspired by Bendy and the Ink Machine, which has a similar premise in and of itself, but personally, I think the most suspicious correlation between these two descriptions is that of these two phrases. Disappeared into thin air, for Poppy's description, and vanished into thin air, for Venge, describing what happened to the companies of the respective games. While not impossible, it does feel very unlikely that the two descriptions would contain this exact configuration of words, save for the swapping of one synonym, with the same context as well. It's still not evidence, but in my opinion, this is the closest thing to it in the entire thread. Next, Ekrcoaster brings up the topic of stolen character designs. Unfortunately, upon revisiting the comparisons he made to back his claims, I don't think this was a strong accusation in the slightest. For the first comparison, there is definitely some correlation between this design and this design, especially around the mouth area, but that alone cannot prove anything. If you thought that was a stretch, the next comparison is even worse. To me, there isn't any noteworthy correlation between these designs. Both do have red smiles and big eyes, but literally any cartoon mascot could look like this. There's nothing overly specific about either of them that can be inherently linked, and to be honest, while this comparison is easily the weakest, I don't think any of them are particularly strong. Ekrcoaster then claims he wouldn't be as accusatory had Poppy Playtime been made by anyone other than EnchantedMob, which is fair enough because of their poor history, but I also don't think this proves anything. Mob's shady history is certainly worth taking into account, but it's not enough to explain why they would do this. I genuinely did believe Ekrcoaster when this situation was first unfolding, but after a more critical analysis today, even as someone who firmly dislikes Mob and especially their content, I really can't say his accusations amount to much without being dishonest and disingenuous with all of you. In truth, the most this thread offers is mere speculation. He just doesn't have a strong case. One might question if Ekrcoaster had spat out these false accusations just to bring popularity from Poppy Playtime to himself and Venge, but I personally doubt that. He doesn't really seem all that concerned in general with Venge's low popularity, as he hasn't advertised it nearly as much as Mob has done with Poppy Playtime, and as for his YouTube channel, he doesn't really upload much content these days that he'd likely want to divert attention to anyway. I genuinely believe Ekrcoaster thought Mob stole his ideas, especially given what had happened in the past. His Twitter thread wasn't the ideal way for him to prove his case, as again, none of his accusations amount to much of anything, but I do understand that he probably felt angry at the time, and didn't consider any better options. Honestly, if I was in his position, it's plausible that I'd do the exact same. Anyway, given how I needed new leads for my analysis with the thread out of the way, I decided to dig around myself and investigate the gameplay of both games and see if I could find any more suspicious correlations there. Don't get me wrong, I'm far too lazy to play either of them, but I did get a pretty good idea of their story progression by watching walkthroughs. So let's get right into discussing the comparisons in the gameplay, shall we? Starting with the premise, both games involve you, the player character, investigating the abandoned facility of a formerly prosperous company that vanished into thin air. For Poppy Playtime, this company is Playtime Co., and for Venge, it's Rotnik Entertainment. Interestingly enough, even suspiciously perhaps, both games start off with a commercial for the respective companies before getting into the actual gameplay. Another similarity I picked up is how at this point in Venge, we see a doll of Lucy the Frog, Rotnik's mascot, which could link to Poppy, who herself is a doll and the mascot of Playtime Co. and Poppy Playtime. Neither of these similarities outright prove anything, but they are worth noting for sure. Venge provides a little more context as to how you actually get to the facility, with the player character being offered money by Rotnik's sister company to investigate, whereas Poppy Playtime immediately spawns the player in the facility with no information besides the pre-established premise. Here's where I bring up something else that might raise suspicion. The starting rooms for the facilities in both games have very interesting similarities, namely the curved desk and the inclusion of the company mascot on the wall at the far end. Again, no solid proof of anything, but one would definitely raise an eyebrow while researching at the very least. I know I did. From then on, both games are about you exploring the facility and solving puzzles to advance in a very Portal-esque fashion. Poppy Playtime, or at least the first chapter of it, ends fast once you confront and deal with the main monster, Huggy Wuggy, and then go on to discover Poppy the doll in her glass cage. Venge, on the other hand, goes on a lot longer, and has a lot more stuff going on that frankly isn't relevant to the investigation. Unfortunately, there really isn't much correlation between the two games after the beginning, other than a very loose connection of event chase occurring in both of them. So, with all this research gathered from the gameplay and from Ekrcoaster's accusations, what is my conclusion exactly? Well, it's complicated, so without further ado, let's get into some possible theories. In my opinion, there's three main theories about what could be going on here that I want to talk about, each ranging from a spectrum from one side of the argument to the other. The theories go as follow. Theory 1, EnchantedMob as a corporate entity intentionally stole ideas from Venge in a conspiracy despite Ekrcoaster over their past feud. Theory 2, a few members of EnchantedMob snuck in stolen ideas despite Ekrcoaster, but the majority of the company and a developer team had no idea. And of course, Theory 3, everything is merely a coincidence and absolutely no ideas were stolen from Venge. Let's start with Theory 1. To me, this is nearly impossible, since it would require the entirety of EnchantedMob to be cartoonishly evil and have zero empathy, which is simply unrealistic. Potential conspiracies operate under a principle I like to call the how many rule. The more people who are in a conspiracy, the more likely that the conspiracy will be revealed to everyone else. So the more people who are allegedly in a conspiracy, the more likely it isn't true, because that conspiracy not getting out would make no sense. This is explained much better by Wendigoon, a recent growing YouTuber whose channel focuses on conspiracy theories and other similar topics.
The reason it freaks me out so much is because there is this concept that is always in the back of my head whenever I'm doing research on this stuff, and there's been different names given to it, there's been different equations worked out for it, but it's essentially the rule that the more people that are involved in a conspiracy theory, the less likely it is to be true. Like, for example, let's take something like the JFK assassination, saying that JFK was assassinated as a work by the CIA or the government or whatever. If that were true, then the number of people who have to know about that could be as small as a group of 10 guys. So, could 10 highly trained agents keep a secret for their entire lives without it ever getting out? Possibly. Also, I realized that if I was looking at that accurately, it would probably be a lot more than 10 people, but let me dream for a second. Now let's take a conspiracy like Flat Earth. If that were true, then it would require that every airline pilot, every boat captain, every navigator, everyone who does any form of traveling, or really everyone who's ever been in a plane, would have to be in on this big plan to try to trick everyone who's not in on it. The secret would probably get out. So what I'm saying is, the more people who are involved in a conspiracy theory, the less likely it is to be true.
In our case, we know it's impossible for all of EnchantedMob to be in on any potential conspiracy despite Ekrcoaster by stealing ideas from his game. Some people working on Poppy Playtime would have felt sympathetic towards him and would likely have exposed the news one way or another. We saw this exact same thing 2 years ago with writers from Animation Sins who spoke out against their upper management being too harsh on Ekrcoaster's animations. No such widespread conspiracy could function without being known about. It's simply infeasible, and as such, I must discard the theory. Next up, we have the theory that not all, but some of EnchantedMob slipped in stolen ideas while Poppy Playtime was being made. This one does have a chance of being true, albeit only a chance. For example, I wouldn't be too surprised if Zach Belanger, the manager who had previously harassed Ekrcoaster, had decided to take another jab at him by stealing some ideas from Venge and putting them in Poppy Playtime, unbeknownst to the dev team who had nothing to do with it. Now, I personally believe this theory for a long time, since it does make sense and align with how the upper members of Mob's corporate structure treated Ekrcoaster before, and I still think there's a good possibility of this being the case. All things considered, I will neither discard nor promote this theory. On to the final theory, and that is simply that none of Ekrcoaster's ideas were stolen, and that he just jumped the gun and assumed they were, based on his history with Mob. This is entirely plausible in my opinion, and I would lean primarily towards saying it's the most likely theory, if not for the few suspicious similarities in the two games I did notice, that I personally have a hard time writing off as mere coincidence. There's a good chance that everyone involved with Poppy Playtime is completely innocent, but if this theory ended up being wrong in the future, I wouldn't exactly be surprised either. Just like with the last one, I won't discard it, but I won't promote it either. And now, we reach my conclusion. Unfortunately, as you can tell, I haven't yet decided what the most likely answer to the Poppy Playtime question is. I'm currently torn between the second and the third theories, and I'll have to look into things a little more before I can determine which one I believe over the other. As it stands though, while I'm not throwing away the possibility, there isn't enough evidence to support the idea that Poppy Playtime stole any number of ideas from Venge, let alone the idea that it's a total ripoff. I believe in innocence until proven guilty, and thus, after this new analysis, despite my previous accusations, I can't in good conscience say that any of the Poppy Playtime devs team stole ideas. It's just not possible to prove. Not now, at least. Honestly, it does kind of upset me that this is the conclusion I ended up reaching. As someone who backed Ekrcoaster early on, I really hoped I would still maintain my full stance after revisiting the situation, but now I just look back on my original reaction to the allegations as biased and immature. I didn't consider things from a critical or logical standpoint, and I really hope this video has solved my previous mistakes. For the record, I still do think Ekrcoaster has good intentions, and I don't dislike him by any means. I already explained why I don't think he made the accusations for attention, and why I think he genuinely believes what he said. However, if there's one thing I know for sure now, it's that oftentimes online drama like this isn't as cut and dry as initially suspected. This video likely won't be the last time I talk about EnchantedMob, Ekrcoaster, or the Poppy Playtime controversy. There is much more to be discussed, and I intend to go more in depth later. That is, if I don't get tired of the drama and just back out of it, which is always a possibility as well. Assuming I do stay involved though, I'll be doing much more research into the subject, and once I believe I have enough information for another video, I'll update you all as soon as possible. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Farewell.